So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, David Burrell, a world-renowned strategist, researcher, and thought leader. David works with global leaders and innovators in business, philanthropy, government, and local communities, guiding them to create an inclusive vision and actionable roadmap for the future, with an emphasis on economic development and resiliency. Over the past 20 years, his work has had a wide-reaching impact on regional and national economic growth and revitalization in the US and internationally. David helps clients create future intelligence by anticipating the rapidly converging forces affecting their lives and livelihoods. He guides them to define and shape their future with the goal of economic and community resiliency and vitality. A native Australian, David's interest in the future began in his childhood growing up on his family's farm. Prior to founding Future IQ, he honed his skills in research and systems thinking as a rangeland scientist in the outback for Western Australian Department of Agriculture for 8 years as the principal advisor to the Minister of Primary Industries. His US base is Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am honored to welcome him today as our keynote speaker. Welcome, David.
Hello, James. Thank you very much for that great introduction. And it's really my delight to be here today with everybody to speculate a little about the future. And as Casey said in the introduction, this is very unusual times, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And really, what I want to sort of walk through today is to sort of lay out what I think are a set of converging trends that are going to shape our lives or set a context for our lives, and of course for the travel industry. And I also want to just compliment the Adventure Travel Trade Association for just doing a fantastic job on putting this event together. I'm going to share a slide deck here. So I want to walk through some data points with you to set the stage for this conversation. All right, so I want to talk about the importance of future thinking. And for some people who are in the midst of, massive crisis. So, either, natural events that are occurring on the West Coast of the USA or an industry that's, sort of hit the brakes. Sometimes thinking about the future is a kind of a difficult concept when you're really dealing with somewhat of an emergency situation. But as you know, as well as I do, all across the board, people are really having important conversations about, how does this pandemic change the future, impact our businesses, and what might it look like? Type of conversations occurring at every level. And I want to walk through why I think this is a very important sort of conversation and what I think some of the trends are that we should be looking at. Now, obviously, we've got a lot of uncertainty, right? And we all know that the factors that create change are incredibly complex and can be moving rapidly. The issue about high levels of uncertainty is it can leave us feeling very confused and wary about the future. So we don't know what to do, right? But we can still anticipate some things that will change. Trends can emerge and evolve, and we can create new trajectories. And so the idea of future thinking is to sort of be quite deliberate about thinking through how might the future unfold and how do we position ourselves for that in a period of great change. The keys to effective future thinking is really to explore and anticipate a range of plausible futures. So right now, we don't know exactly what the future is going to be, but we can think about a range of plausible futures and how would we prepare ourselves for different futures that might emerge, or what would be our preferred future and how do we start to help facilitate that. The other part that's really key from our practical experience is that you have to consider both trajectory and velocity. So in what direction is change going and how fast it's going? And I think the speed of change component is a piece that people often miss as they sort of think about the future. But also we want to think about what are all the different trends that are at play and how they might merge together. But truly the magic of future thinking is that it alters our perception and gives us a sort of a testing ground to think about decisions and how they might play out over time. So in terms of the discussion today, right? So with the current pandemic and a time of elevated uncertainty, and I would argue that this decade that we're in, the decade of the 20s, is going to be a period of profound change. And I want to lay out some of my data points and some of my sort of thesis about that and how that might shape and impact our lives and our businesses and our industries. And what we've been looking at in Future IQ is sort of thinking about these different sort of packages of trends. So in this period of a pandemic and uncertain times, which trends are being amplified and accelerated? So which are those ones that are actually getting a turbo boost? What changes are we seeing that we think might be more elastic? And what I mean by that is that sometimes in periods like this, change occurs, but when something like the pandemic finishes, everything snaps back to the way it was. So that's what I mean about elastic. So we're trying to understand what changes we think will be elastic and what might be more permanent changes. And then there are, of course, potential tipping points. And in periods of elevated uncertainty, and again, I would argue that's really for the next decade, there's a propensity for tipping points to sort of occur at rapid succession. So I want to walk through some of our analysis on these different categories. All right, so trends that we think are being amplified and accelerated. Probably no real surprises here, right? But across the board, so the reinvention of cities. Cities have been for a while and are increasingly looking very deeply at reinventing. How do they design spaces that are safe and connected? How do we make urban living attractive? That trend, as we're seeing, is being amplified and accelerated. We're increasingly seeing cities start to talk about social fabric and how they sort of morph and evolve their society and their community and their infrastructure as a result of the pandemic, but also as the result of growing populations in cities. Application of automation and robotics, no doubt that's being accelerated and amplified as a result of the pandemic. You can just look at which companies are soaring on the stock markets wherever, and you'll see that they're all companies that are really rooted in this automation and robotics. Instant health data, obviously this need to understand people's health, but also personal recognition and tracking. So all these systems that are being put in place that understand where we are and what our health status is and so on, they're being amplified. And quite frankly, I don't think they'll be reversed. I think this will be something that will just become part of our society, just like security cameras are everywhere. And of course, online commerce and retail. We know that everywhere that there's this whole pivot to this sector. Definitely a trend that's been amplified and accelerated. And I wanted to put it in context here because it's important for us to think about what's the underlying technology that's driving some of these changes. So this is a chart that looks at different technologies from 1950 through into the future, cumulative capacity, and this is sort of a schematic that tries to lay out what's happening. And the piece I want to really focus on here for you is about artificial intelligence. So if you can see the artificial intelligence line there, the big issue here is that if you think of underlying technology, if you think of the previous century, it was really embedded in the internal combustion engine. And the next century is really going to be driven by an underlying technology that's around artificial intelligence. And that's become possible because of a combination of emerging technologies such as cloud computing, big data and so on. And we're only very at the start of this. So what I want us to think about is, well, what start to see artificial intelligence really bite in and reshape our society. So in terms of thinking about how this plays out, so this is a schematic that looks at, well, how might certain technologies outperform people, right? So, 2022, folding laundry. So machines and artificial intelligence likely to be better than human beings. That's probably a good thing, right? 2024, translating languages. 2027, driving trucks, and so on. Really, the key point here is that by 2060, artificial intelligence will be able to do all of the tasks that human beings can do and actually do it better. So what does that mean for our future? And for some people, there's a big question about, is this like a dystopian or a utopian future? And that sort of story is being played out. But there is no doubt that we can barely imagine what the impact of these sort of technologies is going to be in terms of how it shapes our lives. And as I talk about this, we should be thinking about, what does this mean for the tourism industry and so on? And one of the sort of kind of game changers might be, how does a virtual world change the travel industry? And how far are we from having a virtual world? You know, you can see the capacity of like flight simulators, you know, even this forum, which is, you know, it's hosted on virtual platforms. People are gathering from all around the world, you know, fantastic technology. At what point does sort of life start to emerge and become more like a virtual world? So what are the implications in outdoor travel? That's the question embedded in these set of trends that are being amplified or accelerated. So I want to talk a little bit too about what changes might be more elastic. So some of the trends that we're seeing at the moment, like mass urbanization, I want to talk about that. Some people are saying, oh, you know, it's the death of cities. The pandemic's going to end that. I don't think so. I want to explain why. Financial equality, obviously an enormous amount of measures have been put in place that to help people survive. You know, does that become the new normal? Working from home and all of the things that go with that. Nationalism versus globalism. So we're all, you know, essentially trapped in our national sphere at the moment. Globalism is suffering some impacts, shifting global wealth. And the longer it lasts, the less elastic trends become, in my view. So the longer that we work from home, the less likely it's to snap back when the situation like a pandemic changes. And I want to just talk about mass urbanization a little bit, because this is a really important underlying driver, I think, of particularly outdoor tourism and travel and so on. And so this is 1950, right? And this is a schematic of the world. The bubbles represent different countries with the number of people who lived in urban environments that were defined as over 100,000 people, right? So you can see the US had 101 million people in the urban environments. UK had 40 million and so on. But India and China had, 60 million thereabouts. 1950. 2020, right? So we see this massive explosion, right? And not only are these cities getting much bigger, the percent of the population of people on the planet who lives in cities is also increasing as a percentage. But if we look forward to 2050, then we have this enormous kind of trend towards people living in cities. And my thesis is that we are becoming an urban dwelling species. There are now more people who live in cities than live in rural or regional areas. And that trend is accelerating. So what does it mean for travel and tourism when human beings essentially become an urban dwelling species? How does that change the dynamic of tourism and travel? Does it mean that people will increasingly seek outdoor experiences to escape from urban environments? And where do they go? And what's the impact in the sort of peri-urban space or the areas around these growing mega cities? There's also a massive change occurring right now in global wealth distribution. So this diagram looks at middle-class consumer spending power. The sort of pies, the slices of pie represent the different regions in the world that are color-coded there. The inner ring is the middle-class consumer spending power in US trillions of dollars in 2009, and the outer ring is 2030. And what we're in the mid, and we're obviously in the middle of that sort of period, but you can see this enormous pivot of middle-class consumer spending power to the Asia-Pacific region. Why is this important? Well, when people hit middle class, they have discretionary income, they start to travel, they start to consume, and so on. So which of these are going to be more elastic, right? So, and what are the implications on outdoor travel? I want to talk about tipping points, right? Because I think this is what I think is going to be the defining issue for the decade ahead. And I would argue that we are facing significant tipping points at the level of societal values, the way we live and behave, that human beings are moving to be living more in insular bubbles, as we call them. Has to be an accelerated environmental awareness and a massive issue coming with the global food industry. But of course, the travel and tourism industry is going to be substantially changed, fundamentally changed would be my prediction because of this set of trends and the way forces are converging. So let me just sort of walk through this a little bit more. At the level of global population, on the left-hand side, these are sort of age pyramids. These are in 4-year age increments. Developed world, you can see that we have a long skinny column, the developing world, right? And what will happen in the next decade is the influence of the massive cohort of people who are under 20 years of age in the world are going to start to really exert a profound influence on the world. So that has all sorts of implications about where people are, what people are consuming, and so on. Of course, in the developed countries, and I've just taken the UK and the United States here and sort of broken those age pyramids out, we have obviously a baby boomer bubble and we have a sort of a millennial bubble. But in the next 10 years, this decade, we will see a significant shift in influence between the baby boomers cycling out of the system and the millennials coming in. And I think that's going to bring with it some really substantial tipping points. There'll be, and we can already start to see it. You can see the sort of the tension under the surface, this desire for change that's being expressed as these societal values come through. And the interesting thing about societal values is they tend not to be just incremental, slow changes. They tend to reach points where they suddenly flip. And then we start to see accelerated change in society. So what we do know, though, for sure, is that emerging generations will have different values and expectations. So what does that mean for travel? And are our businesses geared up for, which demographics, which population, which value set, and so on? And, there'll be a lot of talk, I'm sure, about sustainable tourism and those sort of values. When do they become a tipping point is the sort of question I pose. But at a macro level, there's other big issues here too, which is that, our growing global population is going to lead to an incredible increased demand for basic, components, food, water, energy, and I mean fresh water in this case. Our global population is going to increase by 25%, but that may see up to a 60% increased demand for food, 40% increased demand for fresh water, and so on. Huge global challenges. And if you put it in context of today, this is a world hunger map, and particularly through the African continent and parts of Asia, we already have significant endemic hunger. And that's only going to get worse from a couple of reasons. So one, obviously, is that the rapidly growing populations of Africa and Asia start to consume more resources. So there'll be greater demand and need there. But the other component, and this looks at impact of climate change. So this is from the Nobel Peace Prize modeling looking at long-term implications of climate change, is that there are winners and losers, and that we can see crop yields are forecast to increase in the northern mid-latitudes, but they're forecast to decrease in the same places where the concentration of global populations occurring and where the rapidly growing population is and where people are already hungry. And so this convergence of forces is going to impact us all, no matter where we are in some form. And obviously it's a trend that's occurring, but it's going to be a tipping point trend within the next decade. And of course, we have issues about human health and food disparities. This very unusual conundrum where we have, 2 billion people in one form or another don't get enough. They have some form of undernutrition. And at the same time, we have 2 billion people who get too much in some form, right? So the pressure of that is likely to lead to some profound change in global food systems and what food is, maybe creates potential enormous opportunities in terms of targeted tourism and travel around food and food health. The other issue, and we're going to sort of pick this up more in the panel session, the workshop session after the break, but tourism really is becoming a double-edged sword. And a lot of economies have pursued tourism because it's such a potent economic driver. What's happened with the rapid acceleration, obviously, in global travel is that prior to the pandemic, we were really running up hard against over-tourism and resident alienation and people starting to push back on tourism. And I think one of the big challenges for travel and tourism in the next decade is really working with destinations to find out what is that sweet spot of the balance between the economic impact of tourism, the value it brings, but also the impact on the destination and the people who choose to live there. And really the panel will have later after the break is really going to try and dig into that. But I think that is the big issue for tourism going forward is how to really think about tourism in a balanced way that takes into account the local community, the visitor experience, the impact on the environment, all those things. No doubt it's a massive economic driver, but it brings with it a lot of challenges. So implications on outdoor travel of these tipping points, absolutely could be enormous and profound. And I want to conclude with a couple of my predictions and observations, and just to sort of leave you with these thoughts as we sort of engage in sort of a future thinking conversation about tourism over the next couple of days. So one is, as I've said, that the next decade, so the decade of the 20s, we'll see waves of accelerating change, societal and technological change. Already we're seeing things like the Me Too movements, then the Black Lives Matter, and we're seeing the demand for action on climate change. There's going to be a converging set of fundamental societal changes, and I think things are going to get rocky with that. At the same time, we have technology accelerating, and it's being amplified and accelerated through this current situation. And then it'll be the role of artificial intelligence and how that shapes us and how we work together going forward, and the implications that has for all sorts of industries. The second point there, humans are now an urban dwelling species, right? If you take that presumption that we're an urban dwelling species and that urbanization will accelerate, and I would argue we're well past that critical tipping point. So what does that mean for the travel trade? What does that mean for outdoor recreation? So some of the things is, it means that people are likely to have less of the natural skills, and we're likely to see more visitors going into outdoor recreation areas with less prepared and less used to that. It's a very different experience to grow up in a nature setting versus growing up in an urban setting. But we are very much an urban dwelling species. I mean, developed countries are all going to be around 90% of the population is going to be living in cities of over 100,000. So macro, metropolises and so on. There's also the third point is that we're in a period, this future period, where the demand will be honest to accelerate change or lose, and more so than ever before. The convergent forces are very intense, very potent, and this is trajectory and speed of change. So velocity. So velocity is going to increase. And so while we may have once had time to take our time to adapt and change, the pressure is going to be on to move faster than ever. And my last point there is my judgment is that tourism will be under immense pressure to evolve. We're already seeing a lot of these conversations about, let's use this period of a pandemic to reinvent tourism. But there will be just immense pressure for evolution of tourism, both how people travel, where people go, the impact on the environment, the type of experience that visitors have, the experience of destinations who are hosting visitors. And I think it offers or represents potential sort of pressure points for the industry. Get it right, and parts of the tourism and travel industry can really thrive. Get it wrong, and you start to run up against resentment, resident alienation, and so on. And so going forward, I think it's going to require a lot of really careful thinking and balance from industry representatives, leadership like ATTA, all the various tourism entities in countries and regions and so on, to really think about how do we evolve quite rapidly under immense pressure. How do we evolve the tourism industry? And our window for that evolution and to lay a new track is pretty short, right? So, assuming that coming out of this pandemic, how quickly do things go back to normal? How quickly does travel start again? How quickly does pressure start to build? We'll talk in the panel session about some of the destinations that are already starting to feel immense pressure that are surround these large metropolises, where you're now getting a lot more people who are just doing short visits to get these breaks from the urban environment. So I wanted to conclude there, and it's just been my pleasure to be able to share some of these thoughts with you. I really look forward to engaging in the conference as we go forward. And I really want to just compliment everybody, ATTA, but all the participants in this conference, because I think putting minds together and starting to think about how do you evolve your tourism industry going forward. I think this is just such an incredibly important forum for that. So with that, I'd like to hand back to James to continue the proceedings, and I look forward to connecting with many of you as we go through this event. So thank you.